right, hello. Welcome to this is the last NBJ Live of the year, so we're really happy to be here. I'm here with my colleague Rick Polito. Hey, Rick. We're talking about we're calling it a global view of supplements. What we really mean is just looking at the supplement sales across the globe. We always release a global report near the end of the year, and we just did that recently. So I'll start with a couple data points, and then we'll just get more conversational about the whole thing. So I'm Content and Insights Director with NBJ. Rick is Editor-in-Chief with NBJ, which really, that title ties him to the journal, but Rick is the author of many of our reports and a wealth of knowledge for what we put out here. So happy to be sharing this time with Rick. And let's see, what do I want to say? I always say a little bit about NBJ. If you're watching this, you probably know about us, but we do the what, the where, and the why of the dietary supplements industry, especially from a data perspective. That's what we do. What's selling from ingredient categories and individual ingredients. Where is it selling? That's our channel data. And why is it selling? Meaning, what conditions are motivating that purchase for consumers? So that's who NBJ is, or I don't know, how old are we now? 26, 27, and going strong here. So let's get into some of the numbers, some of the global numbers. The global market is, we're predicting, I mean, we're almost to the end of 2024. We don't finalize that number until we see some more data in the first quarter of the next year. But looking at a global industry that's about 195 billion on 5.5% growth. And the way to read this chart, the bars are the dollars, and that aligns to the left axis, and those are in millions. So that's how those numbers become billions. And the only difference between the teal bars and the gray bars is the teal bars are what we are calling our final numbers, and the gray bars are our estimates for the future. And yes, 2024 is still the future. That P means those are preliminary numbers for 2024. And then that gold line is the growth line, and that aligns to the right axis, those percentages. That huge spike in 2020, that was the pandemic, a big correction in 2022. And we report on dollars, not units. So when we're seeing 1-2% growth, we're really seeing a market that was probably declining in sales from a unit standpoint. But so we could look at just about any region or any country, and we'd see a very similar pattern here. So let's look a little bit more closely. The US is about a third of the market, 34.6% of the market. And if you combine Asia, which we divide up as China, India, Japan, and the rest of Asia, and if you add up those numbers, that's just shy of 32%. So this has been fairly true for several years, where the US is a third of the market and Asia is a third of the market, and then the rest of the world is the rest of the market. But a couple standouts, China is huge. Total Western Europe is the third largest region. The way we cut up the regions, and it's, so that says a lot. For instance, Africa is a region, whereas Europe we cut into some, I don't remember, 20 different countries. So it depends on how you look at it. When we say this is the biggest region, some of the regions are much more populous than others. India, Japan, Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe is in the top, the top few in terms of Eastern Europe combined with Russia in terms of dollars. And then the other way we like to look at it is growth. The top growers are Latin America and Mexico, both at 9.2% growth. Those are the peak growth numbers we see. India is not far behind at 8.7%. And what's really significant there is that Latin America and all combined Latin America, which is basically everything south of Mexico, is growing at 9.2%, and then India is growing at almost 9% as well. So lots of growth there. And then two of the biggest regions, US, I already said, was the biggest region, and then Western Europe, those are both tied at 4.9% growth, which is sub-average growth. If overall the globe is growing at at 5.5%. US and Western Europe are growing at 4.9. So big dollars, big added dollars with those percentages. But looking just at the percentage, we see some lower numbers.
Yeah, and if I could jump in, I think that's, if you look forward and look at our projections there, that makeup, that pie chart's going to look very different based on what those growth numbers are. Just a few years ago, Latin America and Mexico were, much smaller than Western Europe, and now they're approaching the same size. And we see the way, India is growing, get its share up. So we're going to look at this pie chart very differently in a couple of years. I think that's important to note. And I think a lot of the, there's companies who are watching this are part of that, and they know, they're already aware of this, but everybody should be keeping an eye on these high growth things, because, the pie is going to be chopped up very differently 5 years from now than it is now.
Yeah, it's really true. And we've looked east so much of the time, what's going on in China, and now India is really popping up as a place to look. But we've been saying for a couple of years now, it's like we need to be looking south. There's a lot of activity in Latin America and Mexico. Let's go a little deeper in the data then. We're going to look at these top growing regions: Latin America, Mexico, India. Latin America is maintaining roughly 8% growth through the forecast period through 2027. And it's a $250 million in market size. So that can't be the, I'm sorry, $250 billion. I'm sorry, my headline is incorrect there. It's not $250 million. As I say that out loud, that's such a small number. But it's 25
billion.
Yes, it's 25 billion. Pardon me, I tripped myself up there as I look at my incorrect headline. So it's a very large region and good growth through the forecast period going through 2027. So it's really, and this is often we talk about Latin America and Mexico combined, it's probably a really good way to look at it. But for what I have on these slides today, we're separating them out. So this is Latin America.
Yeah, and I think what's important to point out there for me is, like, everybody had that correction after the pandemic, but it wasn't as steep or as deep for Latin America, and then the growth has come back strong in this way that we, more than any other place, or with the exception of possibly India. So in the U.S. market, we all had talked about this new normal we expected, the next normal that was going to come after the pandemic, with all these people who are more informed about supplements and more focused on them, and that this education, this enthusiasm that came out of the pandemic was going to continue. And we didn't see that in very many places, but I would say Latin America is one where that growth, it dipped, but it didn't dip as far, and it stayed steadier since. So I think if we want to see the place where the new normal happened, I would say Latin America stands out to me.
Yeah, that's for sure. We have a question from the audience. Does Brazil hold the largest growth for Latin America? And I think our answer to that question is going to be anecdotal. What's your answer, Rick?
I don't have the answer to that right in front of me. I wasn't as prepared as I should have been on this, but it's always been a big growth driver. I mean, it's a huge economy on its own, and it's got the middle class coming up in all these industries, and it was already sort of there before. So it's not seeing as much change. So I don't know how much of the growth is going to come from there in the future. You look at markets like Colombia, where the middle class is up 50% in the last 20 years or so. I would expect more growth in those areas, but the bulk of the market is still going to be down in Brazil.
Yeah, I think that's my guess too. And our data doesn't drill down by country in Latin America, so we don't really have the answer. But I think that's a good hunch, Antonio, and I agree with you, Rick, that I think that's likely the case. So before I move on from this slide, the correction once again, we're looking at a market that's 25 billion by the close of our forecast period in 2027. And then here's Mexico. Similar growth rates, staying strong. It's dipping below that 8% though that we saw for Latin America. and it's a much smaller economy. I mean, you know, here we are separating out a single country. We've got Mexico, and we've got all the rest of Latin America. So, so these numbers look very small, but it's one country, and we're seeing that at 1.5 billion at the you know, right, we're already almost there, and it's staying there on growth that's above average global growth.
And I think this is one of the regions where we're going to start looking at individual countries, because it's grown on such a larger and larger share of the entire market globally. You know, we can break out in Europe what's going on in several of the bigger markets. We need to start doing that in Latin America, because obviously this is such a big piece of the future.
Yeah, it's so true. To get access to more hard data in those areas will help us to expand our numbers in Latin America. So let's move on then to India. India is inching toward 20 billion with above average growth, and pretty, you know, nicely above average. Again, average growth is 5.5 for 2024, and we're seeing India growing, what did I say, 8.7%, and that growth rate is increasing over the next few years according to our estimates. And it's, you know, it's inching up to a $20 billion supplement economy. So a lot is going on in India.
And that's such another, you know, huge middle class story. I saw some World Bank statistics, but by the middle of this century, they're going to have 60% of the population of the biggest country on earth is going to be in the middle class. I mean, that was the number in the United States back in 1970. Now we're down to 50% is in the middle class. So, you know, think about the middle of the 20th century, how strong the U.S., you know, we were raging ahead. Think about, you know, serving that market.
Yeah.
20 years or so from now, it's going to be.
It's really interesting. And you put some of those numbers in the report, in your writing of the report, and something like it's almost 3 times the middle class of India is now, or at the end of our forecast period, almost 3 times the entire U.S. population. So it's such an opportunity.
Yeah,
especially if that's where the growth is happening, in that middle class, and we think it is. We have a question about India here, so let's look at that. Are growth numbers strictly regional consumer products? Yes. Okay, I see what the question is. Versus growth in supply chain business meeting global demand. Yeah, these numbers that we're presenting here are just consumer numbers. So these are dollars being spent, converted to dollars by consumers in these regions, and it's not representative at all of what's going on for India as a supply, as a, you know, growing and leading part of the supply chain, which is such an important thing to talk about. We can't talk about India without talking about their participation in supply chain.
Yeah, there's people who've talked about a total economy of it, including supply, including this, you know, this growing research component, but the total sort of supplement economy going there between exports, imports, consumer purchases, you know, reaching up to $100 billion at some point in the next 20 years, which is staggering.
Yeah, it really is. And so again, that's why these are the 3 regions we're focusing on today. So throw more questions in the chat. We're talking about Mexico and Latin America. We're talking about India. And we can circle back and talk more about these, but let's go on and let's I just have one slide here for total Western Europe, just by comparison. Similar size here to what we saw in Latin America and India, where it's bigger when you combine all of Western Europe, but it's above 20 billion to 25 billion by the end of the forecast period. And the growth is is the big difference. It's about half the growth that we're seeing in a couple of those other regions. And usually we see that it's a more mature market, so that explains lower growth. But the thing that usually explains lower growth is larger volume, and we're not seeing that here.
Yeah, I think the reactions are different to the economy over the last few years, and you know, but inflation was high across much of Latin America, and they didn't react in the same way that Europe did. And I don't know if it's cultural or what it is, but it's obviously happening.
Yeah, it is interesting. It's always interesting to think about how inflation is going to impact purchases like this. And you
And we,
could make all sorts of assumptions. Go ahead.
I was just saying, we've seen that there's a lingering effect on that. I mean, look at our election. People are, inflation was way down, but people are, that's a primary thing, primary concern. And that could be in Europe, that it's sort of accepted differently there, or the fear of inflation is manifest differently there. And that's might have been part of what we're seeing here. What I have heard in Europe is that the real value brands were doing fairly well, and that the premium brands were doing fairly well. And it's in the middle where the growth is flatter. And it might be related to where people are, how people are perceiving their reaction to this, economic things they've gone through.
Yeah, that reminds me of like what we've been saying, and especially I think about a year ago about the US market. The two fastest growing channels, I believe, were mass market and practitioner. And that really points to two opposite market dynamics: the value brands, the value ingredients and nutrients available at mass market, but also premium brands and premium branded ingredients and all that sold through practitioners. And for both of those to be growing so fast says a similar thing. I think people define value differently, and by and large, it's the really high quality, efficacious products, or the very affordable products. And those are two different ways to define value. And take care of business for people's nutrition. I also think, to some degree, it depends on how people perceive the value on the overall household economy of being healthier. And so if they believe in the value of the supplements and that they'll keep the family healthier, they may perceive that as a long-term saving. So, compared to doctor's visits.
What's funny, I'm not just getting questions through through Zoom here, or through our platform here, but I'm also getting questions over my phone, including from our former boss, Fred Linder, who wants to talk about the tariffs. And that's one of the things I want to hear from the community, where we think that's going to happen. I was just on the phone with somebody else who's talking, about Trump and the tariff talk. How much of that is threats to get people to the table in a different way? How much is really going to come through? And I've also had conversations about the Trump administration with other people, like, so much of this is just going to be talk and bluster, but nobody can know. And so that's a big, we wrote this report in late August, September, we didn't know what was going to happen. And God, I'm waiting to see what that's going to be. Talking about, it's 25% across the board on stuff coming in from Mexico and Canada, adding 10% on the tariffs from China, the BRICS countries at 100%. We don't know what's going to happen and what the retaliatory, element of that is going to be. And then I think that brings up an important point of, if you look at Russia with all the restrictions and, with, U.S. companies having to withdraw from there, and they're still seeing strong growth in Russia. So much of this is hard to predict. And we're always going to have some other, as I said in the thing, everybody's waiting for the new shoe to thud on their balance sheets. And we don't know what the next shoe, the drop, is going to be.
Yeah. It's such a good question about the tariffs. And I think there's going to be short-term impacts too. Like even right now, and I like what you said, Rick, we want to hear from you. What is the impact? Are domestic ingredient suppliers and or just, I should say, not domestic, but anywhere that outside of China, are people buying a lot more from China right now, stocking up before the tariffs hit? I think we could see that happening and impacting the market right now. Whether the tariffs come to be a reality or not, it'll be kind of like COVID days, like stocking up heavy, and then there'll be full warehouses, and then maybe no tariffs.
That's one of the things I heard at Summit from a couple of people trying to move in stuff before the end of the year, before the administration change. And that was months ahead of the election, obviously. But I wonder about the pandemic and all the supplement or the supply chain disruptions there. Maybe everybody's just better at it. Maybe they've been around the bends a few times and seen what's coming at.
Yeah, and there's aspects of it that are things that this industry has been asking for, right? The repatriating of ingredients. Can we support local domestic farmers? And we've kind of switched to making this now about the U.S. market and the supply chain feeding the U.S. market, which admittedly is where we spend most of our time as a journal and as a reporting operation. But the uh, there's some good things that could come of this. But what is the transition to that as we move to domestic supply? And certainly some things just can't be supplied domestically. So what does that mean? And how do we get from here to there?
And people I talk to about this administration coming in, that's one of the negotiating points for the industry when they're talking to the trade officials about how these tariffs are going to come down, being able to express how vulnerable this industry is to tariffs, especially from China.
Yeah. All right. Well, so moving back to my slideshow here, just to show you, this is that's the end of the data that we're going to share, but we're here for a few more minutes for more questions. That's our global supplement business report. It came out, I don't know, about a month ago, and that can be found at nutritionbusinessjournal.com. So hop on over there and look for that report, and throw more questions in the chat. We've got one here. Let's see. The insight regarding trademarked boutique ingredients and mass market was very compelling. Are we also seeing similar alterations in different segments? For example, botanicals versus VMS, et cetera.
I don't know. We don't have that data in region by region for this report. I would say that what we're hearing about in Europe with the premium brands doing fairly well might speak to that, with branded ingredients being such an important element of that.
Botanicals is definitely a strong growth area around the world. But yeah, we don't have quite the specificity. In the US market, we break it down to 6 ingredient categories, vitamins and minerals being 2 of them, herbs and botanicals being 1. And when we go global, we necessarily need to go a little shallower as we go so broad with the data. And so we're combining vitamins and minerals, and then we've got herbs and botanicals, and then we kind of have all else. That's where all the specialty ingredients are, and that's where the sports ingredients are. And I think a lot of the growth in that everything else group is coming from those 2, is coming from specialty and sports. There's also homeopathy in there. There's some other things in there, but sports nutrition seems to be, at least anecdotally speaking, seems to be a big driver in a lot of the economies around the world. So wouldn't you say, Rick? Is that what you're hearing?
Yeah, I think sports nutrition especially, and that's an emerging middle class phenomenon that we're hearing again and again from the people we talk to. And you bring it up anecdotally. We need more anecdotes. We want to hear from people in all these different markets. We in NBJ, the journal, which comes out 11 times a year, we have a global issue, and we've pivoted most of that issue to guest pieces from around the globe rather. And we want to hear, get these voices in from these different markets that know it far better than we're going to. So I'd love to hear from anybody on this call who has expertise in these regional markets, because, I want to bring your voices in, and I want to bring your smarts in, because that's informs much of what this report is, and it certainly just drives our issue.
Yeah. It's so helpful to help drive the issue and then inform our data too. We have another question about personalized vitamins. I think we mean like personalized nutrition overall, and it's a great question. Because that's one of those things that has kind of been the next big thing for about a decade now, right? And it, in some ways, we felt, I think, care of being the acquisition of Care of, it kind of tells the whole story on one level, which is to say that like when Care of got acquired, it's like seemed to prove that, okay, personalized nutrition is really the next best thing. And then when Care of got sold or closed rather, it kind of proves that personalized nutrition isn't really panning out the way we thought it would. But I don't think it's quite that simple. I think there's I still think there's a lot of opportunity in personalized, and part of that has to do with diagnostics and AI and getting these things coming together. And I still think this is anecdotal too, but I really think there's still a big opportunity in personalized, but it didn't pop the way we thought it was in what 2017, 2018.
Yeah, and I think the expectation is going to pop somewhere else or across the globe if it didn't work here. Um, I wouldn't put my money behind that until something gets a lot better or what the need state is for the people. And there's a certain segment of the population that is motivated to get to personalized. And I think what we're way off topic of the globe as far as our expertise about this is, but I think that if you look at things around the gastrointestinal personalization with the microbiome, people there came with urgent needs because they were having gastric issues. And I don't know that translates well to the general thing as, persona drawing back and Kara being shut down, as that proves. So it might end up being really specific and fairly urgent need states that drive it. And only to a certain, not just for those people, the consumers that have those need states, but also have the money to afford it. So it slices down fairly small. If it didn't work at general, it gets it fairly small. And if you get down to different nations where we have different levels of income, I get a global level, it's super uncertain.
Let's take this one last question. Hydration and performance, any insights into whether hydration and performance nutrition is also showing strong growth in international markets? I think it is. And again, it's our data doesn't break it out as nearly as precisely as we do in the US market. So it's hard to say. But I do think, especially in the Western cultures, so Western Europe, US, but also Australia, I think we've seen a lot of innovation coming out in hydration. So I think it's strong there. I don't know about the markets we talked about today, Mexico, Latin America, India. Yeah. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, Rick.
I don't really. Just as much as you say, we don't have it broken down. I would be surprised if it wasn't growing strongly. I mean, it's in a juggernaut here in so many of these trends. It's an easily accessible consumer trend. It's not personalized nutrition. It's grabbing hydration at your local store.
Yeah, and then here in this market, it's I think half of the market is. Half of the unit sales are ending up on someone's desk as they sit and work all day long. It's not an athletic performance nutrition market the way it's set out to be, I think,
Yeah. Bill, you heard my rant about that. We're plenty hydrated. You're getting enough electrolytes in everything you eat. This is a salt-laden country.
Yeah, right. We all got really thirsty.
I'm off my salty soapbox here.
Yeah, that was short. That was a short soapbox.
Yeah. Call me. I can go
on. Well, anything else you want to add, Rick? Or any? I think we've probably don't have time for any more questions. But
no, I think it's just the economics of the global supplement industry is so driven by the sort of the macroeconomics of each of these regions, and it's the growth of the middle class in America and the growth of the middle class in India that are driving these big numbers and making this all possible. And if we could see that in a region like Africa that has this population that's around the same, if you look at the whole continent of India, here's this huge market. If we can get the economy's going here, and that's where the growth in population is for the whole world. It's coming out of Africa. There's opportunity there, but it's not something that the industry can do on its own.
Yeah, and there is such a correlation between production, supply chain and production, and the growing market. I don't know how direct that correlation is, but China is both big in supply and a big consumer market. India is proving to be the same thing. And it is interesting, and I wonder if that's another aspect of Africa. I'm not sure how much we're not hearing nearly as much about production in Africa, especially aside from certain ingredients, And so, as that production and that supply gets built up in Africa, it might correlate to, and a a simultaneous growing middle class that could really show the market.
Yeah,
growing.
I'm desperate for insight from there. Anybody on this call that has Africa expertise, please call me. We're only as smart as what we can get from the community. And so I make that plea all the time, whether I'm at Summit or any of the trade shows, is you international people, call me, please.
Yeah. There was one more question. We'll squeeze it in here. Insights into the growth of mushroom supplement space. I mean, mushrooms are just topping out growth here in the US, and I think it's tapering off, but I think mushrooms are going to be one of the strongest categories for a while. And I think that's true by and large. We track mushrooms in herbs and botanicals. So a lot of that herbs and botanicals growth we're seeing around the globe is in mushrooms. I don't think anyone's as hot on mushrooms as the US market, though. I haven't heard anyway that other markets are quite as excited.
Yeah, and I wish we could pull it out of the herbs and botanicals numbers, even though we know where that is, and that's such a strong growth element all over the place, and particularly down in the Latin American markets.
Yeah. Well, there we are. We're over time. Let's call it. And thanks so much for joining us. And thank you, Rick. Thanks for being here. And happy December to everyone.
Yeah, and everybody out there, call me, email me, tell us your international global perspectives.
Wonderful. Thank you.